Before the flames rose and the plantations fell, there were whispers. In the early 1700s, in the thick, humid lands of South Carolina and the Caribbean, enslaved Africans began to pass stories from mouth to mouth. Not stories of fear, but of courage. Of freedom. Of people like them, who refused to be owned. In the fields, they spoke in coded language. A word here. A nod there. While white overseers thought they were mumbling songs, they were passing messages.
Welcome to the Glorious Historian, where the silenced voices of enslaved Africans resound through time. From brutal chains to unbroken spirits, we unveil their struggles, resilience, and legacy. Subscribe now, share your thoughts below, and journey deeper into their truth. Let their voices guide your heart. Listen on.
The ancestors had once been kings, warriors, and priests. Their bodies had been taken, but not their minds. Not their fire. In the West Indies, a young Akan man named Kofi watched as his brother was beaten for speaking his native tongue. He clenched his fists until blood dripped from his palms. That night, under cover of darkness, Kofi gathered 5 other men. They made a pact. If one of them died, the others would carry the fight. In the Carolinas, whispers of maroon societies, hidden free black communities deep in the swamps, inspired hope. Women would sing lullabies to their children with secret meanings. Run to the woods, the stars will guide you. The enslaved knew they were outnumbered, outarmed, and watched constantly. But they also knew this: no one would give them freedom. It had to be taken. There was no single uprising. There were hundreds, some lasting minutes, others years. Some failed before they began, others sent shockwaves through empires. But every single one mattered. In Jamaica in 1690, hundreds of enslaved people on the Clarendon plantation revolted. Armed with tools and machetes, they killed overseers and fled into the hills, joining Maroons who had escaped decades earlier. From these hills, they launched raids, burned crops, and waged guerrilla warfare that would last for generations. But the seeds of rebellion weren't just in Jamaica. On the North American continent, the Stono River would soon run red. Africans from the Kingdom of Congo, many of them baptized Christians and former soldiers, would use their military knowledge in the colonies. They waited. Watching. Planning. The spark was already lit. To white slave owners, these were insurrections. To the enslaved, they were declarations of humanity. And while many were captured or killed, their names were not forgotten. In the shadows of cotton fields and sugarcane rows, their memory lingered, as quiet defiance in a bowed head, as strength in a whispered song. The time of reckoning was drawing near. And with it, the fire. September 9, 1739. Just before dawn. The air was thick with summer humidity near the Stono River in South Carolina. While white families slept in their homes, a group of enslaved Africans began to gather, each one stepping out of their quarters silently, leaving behind the illusion of obedience. At the center of this gathering was a tall, imposing man named Jemmy. He was from the Kingdom of Congo, once a soldier, now a slave. But today, he would lead something far greater than survival. He would lead a revolt. Jemmy had planned this for weeks. He knew who could be trusted, who spoke Portuguese, who had military experience. Many of them had been baptized Catholics in Congo, forced into slavery after Portuguese colonization. Now they were ready to reclaim their dignity with fire and blood. They broke into a local store, seized firearms, gunpowder, and ammunition. They killed the 2 storekeepers, the first bloodshed of the rebellion. Then, they raised a banner and began marching south, shouting in Portuguese, "Liberty." It was not just a word. It was a scream of pain, fury, and memory. As they marched, they burned plantations, freed other slaves, and killed white slaveholders who resisted. Their numbers grew. From 20 to 50 to over 70. Some carried rifles, others tools and axes. All carried a desperate hope. Jemmy led them with precision. He was no mere laborer, he moved like a general. The group marched in formation. They spared enslaved people and even some white civilians who did not resist. But the goal was clear: reach Spanish Florida, where freedom was promised to those who escaped British colonies. But by midday, the rebellion met its first resistance. A white militia, alerted by smoke from burning plantations, mobilized quickly. They intercepted the rebels outside a field near the Edisto River. The clash was brutal. Gunfire, screams, blood soaking into the dirt. Some rebels fought to the death. Others were captured or scattered. Jemmy's fate remains uncertain. Some accounts say he died in the fighting. Others say he escaped into the swamps, joining maroon communities who kept the spirit of rebellion alive. In the days that followed, the remaining rebels were hunted. Dozens were executed. Their heads were displayed on pikes along the roads, a warning to others. The South Carolina government quickly passed harsher slave codes, banning education, gatherings, and movement without permission. But something had changed. The Stono Rebellion, though crushed, had ignited fear in the hearts of slaveholders and courage in the hearts of the enslaved. Word of Jemmy's march spread, carried by whispered stories and songs across colonies. He became a legend, a symbol that rebellion was not only possible, but righteous. The rebellion had failed tactically, but succeeded symbolically. It proved that even under chains, the human soul could not be fully broken. The fire hadn't died. It had only moved underground. The days following the Stono Rebellion were filled with fear, not just for white plantation owners, but for the enslaved themselves. The colony of South Carolina had never seen such organized resistance. Now, it responded with brutal speed. Militias hunted down any remaining rebels. They used dogs, local patrols, and paid informants. For every captured rebel, there was no trial, only swift, public execution. Bodies were displayed at crossroads, left for days to rot in the sun, meant to serve as warnings. Some enslaved Africans were hanged, others were burned alive. But repression did not stop with the rebels. Planters across the colony imposed curfews, banned gatherings of more than 2 slaves, and enforced night patrols. It became illegal for enslaved people to learn to read or write, fearing the exchange of messages or coded plans. Even drumming and dancing, vital parts of West African culture, were banned under suspicion they could be used to coordinate future uprisings. The Negro Act of 1740 was passed quickly. It stripped enslaved Africans of nearly all rights, forbade education, travel, and even modest expressions of autonomy. Masters were required by law to control their slaves more strictly. It was no longer just an economy, it was a police state. Yet despite this tightening grip, the spirit of rebellion remained. Whispers spread among the enslaved community. Some still spoke of Jemmy in secret, calling him the man who dared. The story of his leadership was told in hushed tones, around fires, passed down to children like a sacred tale. Elders preserved his name in Gullah folktales, reshaping the facts into myth, but keeping the core: resistance is possible. Others took inspiration and began planning in secret, waiting for opportunity. Even among white society, the rebellion sparked unease. Some questioned the morality of the slave system. Religious leaders, especially Quakers, began calling slavery incompatible with Christian values. But these voices were few and often silenced. In Charleston, slave owners formed formal militias with regular training drills. Watchtowers were constructed. Militia laws were changed so that every white man between ages 16 and 60 was obligated to be armed and ready. Plantations became fortresses. Enslaved Africans began to live with new trauma layered upon the old. Fear of punishment now came with even tighter surveillance, but the rebellion had taught them one crucial lesson: the slaveholders were afraid too. Families were broken up as punishment. Rebel families were often sold separately, children to one region, mothers to another. This strategy was meant to eliminate lineage and the passing down of defiant ideas. But it had the opposite effect: memories burned deeper. The Stono Rebellion would not be repeated immediately. But it opened the door, a signal that even in the darkest bondage, the human will could stir, organize, and rise. The message had been delivered. The cost had been high. But the flame had not gone out. In hidden corners of South Carolina's backwoods, and whispered beneath the sound of cracking whips, stories still traveled like wildfire. In the wake of overt rebellion came a different kind of resistance, quieter, but just as powerful. Across the plantations and fields, enslaved Africans began to fight in ways the slave masters could not predict. They used their bodies, time, and knowledge as tools of sabotage. One of the most common forms was work slowdowns. A task that could be done in an hour was drawn out to take a full morning. Tools were accidentally broken. Seeds were planted incorrectly, or harvests delayed just enough to cost the planter money. Because the enslaved knew the land better than the owners did, they used that knowledge to manipulate the results, and there was little evidence to punish them with. Some feigned illness or injury. Others simply walked off into the woods when unobserved, returning days later with excuses. This day-to-day resistance, as historians later called it, was a subtle war of attrition, a long, quiet refusal to fully submit. Women were central to this resistance. Enslaved mothers passed on African traditions, language fragments, and resistance stories to their children. These oral legacies gave meaning to suffering and taught the young that they came from something older and greater than the chains they wore. Some mothers took even bolder steps. There are documented cases where enslaved women used herbal knowledge to prevent pregnancies, or, in the most tragic cases, ended them, rather than bear children into slavery. It was a cruel choice, but a deeply human act of protest. Music also became a weapon. Spirituals and field songs often had double meanings. To the overseers, they were harmless tunes; to the enslaved, they were coded messages. A song about crossing the river might mean escape was coming. Singing in rhythm could organize timing for collective acts. Drums, once outlawed, were replaced with body percussion, hand claps, foot stomps, rhythms tapped on knees and chests. This silent drumming preserved cultural patterns and allowed communication across fields, even while guards stood watch. Religion, too, became a space of defiance. Christianity was often forced upon the enslaved, but many interpreted the stories differently than their masters intended. Moses became a hero not of obedience, but of liberation. Jesus was not just a savior, but a rebel against unjust powers. The invisible church, held secretly in woods or cabins, was a sacred refuge. There, enslaved Africans cried out not just to God, but to justice. Not every act was gentle. Tools were stolen. Buildings were set ablaze. Horses let loose. Some poisoned food meant for the master's table. These acts were dangerous and often fatal if discovered, but they continued. The enslaved had no army, no flag, no state. But they had memory, creativity, and a will to survive. Each small defiance was like water wearing away stone. And over time, those in power began to sense that no matter how harsh the punishment, something deeper, and unbroken, moved beneath the surface. While many enslaved Africans resisted quietly, others chose a more dangerous path: escape. Throughout the Americas, from the dense swamps of Louisiana to the rugged mountains of Jamaica, runaways formed hidden communities. These groups, called Maroons, became legends in the fight for freedom. The word maroon comes from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild or untamed. And that is how the slavers saw them, wild people, living free beyond their reach. But the Maroons were not wild. They were organized, disciplined, and determined to defend their independence at any cost. Escaping was not easy. The forests were thick. Patrols were everywhere. Slave catchers hunted with dogs trained to follow the scent of fear. Those who ran risked death, or worse, mutilation. Yet still, they ran. Often in small groups, sometimes alone, with nothing but hope and willpower. The newly escaped had to survive in unknown terrain. Many relied on their knowledge of herbs, hunting, and the stars, wisdom passed down from their African ancestors. Some were helped by free black communities or sympathetic indigenous tribes, who saw the struggle of the runaways as part of their own resistance against colonial forces. In the deep woods, escaped Africans built secret settlements. These were not just hiding places, they were new societies. There were leaders, rules, traditions. Children were born free. Songs were sung in African tongues. Some groups lasted for generations without being recaptured. In Jamaica, the Maroons became such a strong force that the British were forced to make peace. In 1739, they signed a treaty that gave the Maroons autonomy in return for peace, and for helping return future runaways, a tragic compromise that remains debated to this day. In the American South, swamplands like the Great Dismal Swamp became home to small Maroon colonies. Deep in the mud and mist, they built elevated cabins, planted crops, and lived free, even if only a few miles from the plantation. These communities were often targets. Colonists organized raids to wipe them out. Fires were set. Food poisoned. Those captured were tortured to send a message. But the fear worked both ways. The very idea that freedom could be seized, that resistance could succeed, haunted the minds of slaveholders. And inspired others to follow. Runaways who returned to plantations, whether voluntarily or captured, often brought news of Maroons, stories of the free. These tales fueled imaginations. Some believed they could reach these hidden lands. Others simply found courage in knowing someone had escaped. The Maroons represent a different kind of rebellion, not an attack, but an exodus. Their resistance was rooted in creation, building life, community, and spirit beyond the grasp of slavery. They proved that even in the darkest corners, the human hunger for liberty would find ways to grow. While some escaped into freedom, others stayed and began to organize. These brave men and women understood that the system would never willingly release them. If freedom was to be found, it had to be taken. And so, in secret, they plotted. The plantation was not just a place of suffering. It was also a network, a place of whispered messages, silent nods, and trust built over pain. Messages passed from field to kitchen, from stables to quarters. Plans unfolded not with paper and ink, but with songs, prayers, and stories that carried meaning known only to the enslaved. Most uprisings began the same way, with silence. A trusted group of leaders would gather after dark in secluded spots, behind barns, near rivers, inside abandoned sheds. They studied the overseers, watched guard rotations, tracked weapon locations, and marked the days of feast and rest when security would be lower. Religion played a role too. Secret spiritual meetings, often called invisible churches, were more than worship. They were meeting grounds, where coded hymns carried hope and instructions. Steal away to Jesus, they sang, but it also meant, meet at the edge of the woods tonight. Trust was everything. A single betrayal could doom dozens. So planners relied on kinship ties, lifelong bonds, and oaths sealed with pain. Some even performed rituals rooted in African traditions, ceremonies that invoked strength and protection from ancestors. Most of those involved in planning knew the risks. If caught, they faced death by hanging, dismemberment, or burning. Yet they continued. Why? Because they could no longer watch their children born into chains. They could no longer serve a master who beat them bloody for spilling soup. Freedom was worth any price. In these planning stages, women played a powerful role. As cooks, wet nurses, and housemaids, they moved between quarters and households with more freedom than men. They smuggled knives wrapped in rags, passed notes beneath loaves of bread, and carried secret messages in lullabies. Some even seduced overseers to gather information. The planners studied past failures. They knew that many uprisings had been crushed before they began. So they adapted. They staggered attacks, used fire to cause confusion, poisoned livestock, or targeted key figures first. Timing was everything. Many rose during storms or holidays when the enslavers were least alert. Even so, some plans fell apart. A child spoke too loudly. A jealous rival informed. A trusted friend cracked under the lash. Entire families were wiped out for suspicions alone. Yet despite the dangers, these plans continued across the colonies, hundreds of plots, big and small, each one an ember of rebellion glowing under the ashes. The enslaved knew what they risked. But they also knew what they fought for. And across the dark fields, whispers turned to movement. The night of the uprising often came quietly. There were no drums, no loud speeches. Only a silence more deafening than sound. The enslaved would gather in darkness, hearts pounding, hands trembling, knowing that before dawn, their world would change forever. In the distance, dogs barked. Torches flickered. Somewhere, an overseer laughed, unaware that the very people who served him supper now held hidden blades beneath their tunics. The air filled with smoke and shouts. Some cried out in Yoruba, Mend, or Congo. Others prayed in whispers. The plantations became war zones, with shadows battling shadows in the night. But not all rose. Some enslaved people, frozen in fear or loyalty, did not join. Some warned the masters. Some were forced to fight against their own. Rebellion, like freedom, was never simple. By sunrise, many uprisings had succeeded, if only for a moment. The masters fled, the overseers dead or scattered. The enslaved stood not as property, but as people, armed, unbroken. But soon came retaliation. Militias. Hounds. Cannons. The punishment was brutal, swift, and public. Heads on spikes, bodies left hanging for days. Entire villages burned. Freedom, it seemed, had a price few could afford. Yet in those short hours, something unshakable had been born, the proof that even the most brutal system could crack. That those deemed less than human could rise like warriors, burn like stars, and whisper a truth no lash could silence. We are not yours. We never were. Not every uprising ended in glory. Behind every act of courage lay shadows of betrayal. It was a cruel irony that some of those who fought hardest for their master's favor were the ones who led the militia to the rebels' doors. In many cases, overseers had groomed select enslaved men to serve as intermediaries, drivers, house servants, or informants. These individuals, placed in a false proximity to privilege, often found themselves torn between fear and loyalty. Some, broken by beatings or promised freedom, betrayed their own kin. The whispers traveled fast, someone told. Plans changed. Hideouts were abandoned. Arms hidden again in soil. Hope, once sharp and ready, dulled by mistrust. In a known uprising near the Mississippi River, a group of rebels had seized the plantation's arsenal, only to be surrounded hours later by mounted patrols who knew their exact movements. When the dust settled, a lone survivor said, "It was our brother who opened the gate." Betrayal was not only a weapon of the enslavers, it was also a wound within the enslaved. Mothers who had begged their sons not to rise. Elders who prayed for quiet submission. It was a divide born of survival instinct, a system so cruel it turned kin against kin. Some resisted betrayal by swearing oaths sealed in blood or prayer. Rebel groups would mark themselves with sacred signs, chant names of ancestors, or invoke gods to bind them. Others operated in secret cells, small groups unaware of each other's full plan, so that if one were caught, the rest might survive. When betrayal occurred, the consequences were swift and brutal. Militias didn't seek to reclaim the enslaved, they sought to make examples. Captured rebels were paraded through towns, their arms shackled, their mouths gagged. Some were branded. Others mutilated. In Charleston, a rebel named Cajo was said to have bitten off his own tongue to avoid speaking names under torture. His silence became legend, passed down like scripture. But for every Cajo, there were others who cried under fire, and named names just to breathe another hour. Slaveholders used these moments to deepen their control. They introduced new codes, forbidding gatherings after dark, punishing literacy, banning drums and certain songs. Fear became law. Still, uprisings continued. Not despite the betrayals, but because of them. Each rebellion reminded the system that its foundations were not invincible. That fire always smolders beneath ash. And sometimes, the very people who had once betrayed the cause came back, older, wiser, filled with guilt. Some would aid a future rebellion. Others left messages hidden in hollow trees or sang coded warnings in work songs. Because even betrayal, in the end, could not break the truth, the desire for freedom lives in all, even in those too scared to reach for it. In fields where voices once sang to ease the rhythm of forced labor, a new kind of song began to rise, one not meant to pass time, but to signal war. These were not the spirituals sung to white ears. These were layered codes, rhythms hidden within melodies, messages wrapped in metaphor. A song about crossing the Jordan could mean escape. A shift in verse could warn that patrols were near. These rebellion songs spread like wildfire, passed mouth to mouth, hidden in praise. Enslaved people would gather at night under the guise of prayer meetings, their voices lifting skyward in chorus. What sounded to an overseer like religious fervor was, in truth, a strategy session masked in music. Music had always been more than sound in African culture. It was memory, history, and prophecy. Drums had been banned across the South for this very reason, too much power in rhythm. But songs remained, and in them lay the drumbeats of resistance. Children learned these songs from their mothers as lullabies. Young men practiced verses while tilling soil. Women wove lyrics into washing, into sewing, into the careful brushing of hair. Every line was a legacy. Some uprisings were entirely coordinated through song. A call and response shouted across fields might trigger a signal. A hymn might contain a rendezvous point. Even silence, a sudden hush, could mean now. A powerful example comes from Georgia, where a rebellion was led by a man known as Isaac. He had been a preacher, gifted in voice, respected by all. He used his sermons to plant the seeds of insurrection, replacing biblical figures with veiled images of freedom fighters. Moses didn't part the sea, he said once, he burned the ships behind him. Under his leadership, groups memorized entire plans to melody. There was no need for written maps or scrolls. Everything was in the song: who to follow, when to strike, where to run. When the uprising began, it was with music. Voices rose from the quarters like a choir. By the time overseers understood, it was too late. Even after the rebellion was put down, the song survived. Some were whispered into the ears of newborns. Others were smuggled north, carried by escapees who became conductors on the Underground Railroad. Some transformed into spirituals still sung today, their origins forgotten but their power undiminished. Slaveholders feared these songs. They couldn't be confiscated. Couldn't be locked in chains. And they gave power to the voiceless. In song, the enslaved told the truth when silence was enforced. They remembered those who had fallen. They mapped hope across a broken land. In song, they were free, even if only for a moment. For every uprising, there came a brutal response. The system that enslaved African people was not just built on labor, it was maintained through terror. After rebellions, no matter how large or small, punishment followed swiftly and publicly. It wasn't enough for authorities, and yet, even in silence, the spirit endured. Some rebellions left no records. The evidence destroyed. The names forgotten. But their memory lived on in scars and silence. In strange rituals and words no one could translate. Though many of the uprisings ended in tragedy, they were never truly failures. Each revolt, no matter its size or outcome, was a spark. A reminder that the enslaved were never fully broken. Never fully silent. In time, these sparks would ignite larger fires. The Haitian Revolution in 1791 changed everything. It was more than a rebellion. It was the first and only successful slave uprising that led to the founding of a free black republic. Enslaved Africans and freedmen on the island of Saint-Domingue overthrew the most powerful colonial army of its time, France. News of Haiti spread like wildfire. To enslaved people across the Americas, it was proof that victory was possible. That centuries of bondage could be undone. That freedom was worth fighting for. To slaveholders, it was a nightmare made real. Laws grew stricter. Chains grew tighter. Yet fear also crept into the hearts of those who once ruled without question. They saw Haiti and realized, what was done there could be done again. In the American South, slave patrols doubled. Literacy bans became harsher. Secret meetings were met with violence. But the memory of Haiti lingered. And many who dreamed of freedom now had a model to follow. Not all would succeed, but the seeds were planted. In South Carolina, Denmark Vesey planned an uprising of thousands in 1822. Though betrayed before it began, the planning alone shook the region. In Virginia, Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 led to the deaths of over 50 white people. The retaliation was brutal, dozens of enslaved men were killed, but the message was clear: rebellion lived on. The uprisings were not isolated. They were a continuum, a rising tide. Even when unspoken, the stories of those who fought back remained in whispers, lullabies, and family tales. Passed from one generation to the next like sacred fire. And they lived not only in memory, but in culture. Spirituals, folk songs, and proverbs carried coded messages. Steal away to Jesus meant more than prayer. Wade in the water was a map. These songs were rebellion set to rhythm. Language used as resistance. The enslaved were never merely victims. They were strategists. Teachers. Warriors. Survivors. They endured the unimaginable, and yet dreamed still of freedom. They fought with fire and blade, but also with knowledge, patience, and hope. The story of the uprisings is not only about death, but dignity. Not only about chains, but courage. Every name we've forgotten mattered. Every failed rebellion gave strength to the next. And every spark, no matter how small, fed the flame. That flame would not die. It smoldered through centuries, across plantations and prisons, songs and sermons, until, one day, it would burn too bright to ignore. This is not the end of the story. This is only part one.